All right, and welcome back to St. Paul University Faculty of Philosophy. I am Dr. Feist, and still working our way through the Nicomachean Ethics. Book 6, Chapter 13, drum roll, please, the wrap-up. So, in this chapter, Aristotle is going to complete his discussions more or less of virtue. We'll pick a little bit up about them a little later on. But really what he's done now is kind of wrapping up all of his discussion of, and there have been many of them, as we know, of the different kinds of virtue, the two different kinds, right? There's been the moral virtues, the character virtues, which are the results of learning through habits, right? Regular, plain old experience, learning to control your emotions and getting those things all set up so that they incline in the right way, so that your character, shall we say, has a tilt to it. It's inclined, your emotions are inclined to work in the right direction. But of course, it's more complex, as we know, that it involves choice, it involves reason and rationality. Well, the emotions aren't really like that. They can be controlled, they listen sort of like children, but you need to graft on the other virtues, and that is the intellectual ones. And we've seen Aristotle go through the different ways that the mind grasps truth. So those big 5 intellectual virtues, techne and so on, episteme and all that, down to Phronesis, Sophia, and nous. And now we have gone through sort of the minor intellectual virtues, you know, the Ebola and synesis and so on and so on. We've got those 4 now, and Aristotle's sort of wrapping things up. So you've got all these virtues, and how does this, you know, all fit together? How are we going to wrap this up? Well, he says at the beginning, he says, look, I want to reconsider arete, the whole thing of virtue. And he wants to point out a few things. If you recall in the last video, I was talking about Aristotle kind of sliding close to saying certain things are kind of natural, that nature seems to give us virtue, but that seems to have a tension with what he said in the earlier parts of the book by saying nature gives us capacities, not virtues. Well, he kind of moves around a little bit on these issues, but here I think he's trying to clarify some of these things. Like, what exactly does nature give us? And we often say that people are, you know, kind of born with certain, not just capacities that they then just develop in a certain direction or whatever, but we do often look at some children, for instance, seem to be calmer, some to be a little more aggressive. It's not the case that children are just, you know, right away all the same, and then they just differentiate according to their environments. That seems to be too much of a downplaying of nature and all about nurture. Because we often say, oh yeah, and Aristotle, of course, recognizes this too. Plato talks about this as how children often resemble their parents. And the colloquialism that we use, like apples don't fall far from trees. So Aristotle wants to bring that back into his analysis. And so he weakens this notion of nature just gives us capacities and the rest is all virtue and learned through practice or taught in instruction. So how does he do that? Well, he basically just asserts it. He doesn't really argue for this. He just says, look, if we reconsider arete, and in particular, he wants to look at phronesis and dinoteres. Remember, dinoteres was that shrewdness that I talked about in the last video. If you don't remember that, go back and check out the previous video. And he says that phronesis and dinoteres are similar, but not identical. But they play a role in each other. So they're part of the piece, as I've been stressing. It's probably not easy to keep all these things apart in Aristotle's discussion and in some of his discussions, namely in De Anime. He admits that the soul's not carved up into slices like a pizza pie. That's the wrong analogy. It's much more of a unity than that. In any case, we can think of these as sort of different processes or operations that kind of flow into each other. Well, he says if we look at phronesis and dinoteres, similar, not identical. This dinoteres, it is one of our minor virtues, the minor intellectual virtues, serves a role in phronesis, and he comes back and says, okay, look, let's be clear. Phronesis really is learned. Okay, it's got that sort of logic to it, and you really, it's something that you do learn. but he says, this Dinotetes, even though it is an intellectual virtue, and yeah, they're learned, they're not by nature, he says that Dinotetes has a kind of a natural order or a natural origin. That's probably better than order, would be origin, put it that way. So instead of the notion that Dinotetes is all completely learned, Aristotle is going to open up this issue that I think he's saying corresponds to the way we normally talk, and he opens up this issue of natural virtue. So nature does kind of tilt us. Nature doesn't really produce human beings that are bias-free, that are character bias-free. And by character bias, I just mean, some people are born a little bit more aggressive than others, according to what Aristotle seems to be getting at. Some people maybe a little more pacifist, or some people lean a little bit more to reason, a little bit more to emotion, etc., etc. Now, Aristotle is very clear. You don't just say, oh, well, I was born this way and that's it. No, he wouldn't accept that. But he is saying that, we're born in slightly different ways. And so nature does give us these natural types of virtues. And the natural virtues can be really examples of what intellectual virtues, like Dinotetes, could be a kind of natural origin. But in this chapter, he talks mostly about the notion of character virtues, or character arete. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up on my pronunciations. Arete, acquired character arete, that's habituation. So what Aristotle is going to introduce is this sense of arete by nature, which is not really true virtue. So arete by nature, like a natural character arete, that's kind of how you're born to be disposed to be some way or another. That's bestowed by nature. And then the acquired one is, shall we say, through habituation. This is more of the true sense of it. So, in other words, Aristotle wants to be able to handle issues like, well, there's some people that just seem to be kind of pretty good on their own. They don't seem to need all this training. This harkens back to some of the criticisms of all this stuff about Phronesis and Sophia and all that we saw in previous chapters, right? So Aristotle is wanting to admit, because the evidence is there, that some people are just seem to be naturally good, if you want to call it that. And Aristotle says, yeah, there is that case. But he warns us. He says, well, okay, there is a sense of some people being naturally good. They have naturally good character dispositions. They're naturally nice and friendly, and they have all these things, that we would normally say those are learned or acquired through habituation. They just seem to be that way on their own. And Aristotle would say, yeah, there is a natural character virtue. But what he stresses that's a bit unstable. It's because it doesn't really have a solid foundation through being reinforced over time in experience, like the acquired character arete through habituation. So those dispositions of character are reinforced over and over and over. They're pretty solid. Natural character arete is not going to have that stability. He thinks that could be changed or pushed around more than the acquired one. And the same thing of any sense of, and as we have it in Dinotetes, any kind of intellectual virtue that's sort of got a natural side, so a natural intellectual virtue, if I may take the liberty to put it that way, that too can be there, but it's going to be, shall we say, wobbly. So the true virtues are solid, they're acquired, they're stable, you can rely on them, and the other ones that by nature, well, they're kind of there, but they're weaker and they're wobbly. So, and Aristotle puts this by saying, well, look, what you're not going to have by the natural character aretes are going to lack, he says, is lacking nous. Now, it's not really clear what he means by this, but I think in general, as some interpreters and some translators have put footnotes saying that, well, what he's really probably talking about when he says that the natural character arete, the naturally virtuous person is lacking nous, is really lacking nous like in the broader sense, because remember, nous is coupled to Sophia, giving you episteme, right? it's sort of coupled to episteme giving you Sophia. Oh, got to make sure I get that one straight. So nous and episteme give you nous and episteme give you Sophia, but nous is also playing a big role, as we saw, in phronesis as well. So he's probably using nous, we could read him as talking about phronesis in the large sense. So if you're lacking phronesis, lacking this ability, these natural character virtues could lead to a disaster. And Aristotle gives us an image to think about when we think about the natural character virtue. He says, if you imagine somebody, like a big wrestler guy or somebody who's very strong and kind of heavy and has been moving around, right, and can move, right, can move quite well, like maybe a big football linebacker or something like that. Somebody who's large and can get around. If you imagine someone like that suddenly being blinded, right, and then continue to try and move around. That's what natural virtue, kind of like the power and the strength. Natural virtue, the natural character virtue is like the power and the strength. And the sight is like nous or phronesis. So if you had someone who was naturally very powerful, naturally very strong, yeah, they might do good things, but it would be, by accident, par hasard, right? It wouldn't be something that's nice and focused and directed. And somebody, of course, who was suddenly blinded like that would be just sort of, like a bull in a china shop, as they say, just smashing stuff all over the place. So someone freighted with natural virtue, it could basically be someone like without sight and could lead to a disaster, he says. All right. So in other words, true character virtue, as Aristotle says, really, he comes to the conclusion and makes a distinction between sort of this natural character virtue. Yeah, some people are naturally good, but it's not as reliable. True character virtue, in the true sense, is not going to exist. It cannot exist without phronesis. So you got to have phronesis as part of the story. So ultimately, to truly be truly virtuous, Aristotle comes to the line of saying, look, you got to have phronesis, you got to have this rationality. So in that sense, yeah, you can make the argument that Aristotle does say at the end of the day, reason has to run the show in order to be truly virtuous and not accidentally or just you happen to get it right sort of virtue through natural things. Now, that, of course, raises the question, is Aristotle, can we just say that, well, at the end of the day, he's kind of this reason worshiper because it's got to be in charge? Well, it certainly looks to be along those lines since he's insisting about the notion of true character virtue. To be a true character, maybe a true human being, you have to have this rationality in charge. Now, think of the ramifications of that. Because Aristotle, is he saying that if you don't have true character virtue, if you don't have this sense of phronesis, if you don't have ultimately reason running, you don't have really like a true human character? Is he saying that? It's not clear. It's debatable what he's saying with this. All right. So nonetheless, we can take it that Aristotle deeply stresses the importance of phronesis. And yet, on the other hand, you can say, well, you could be naturally good. So he's not a complete intellectualist about ethics as, say, Socrates was. And Socrates is going to come up again in a bit here. Aristotle, at least, is toning that down. He's certainly not saying that virtue is identical to knowledge, because he does, again, have this understanding of this question of natural virtue. So he's allowing for nature to play an important role, even in an ethical sense. Now, Socrates, Aristotle says, was wrong to say that all the virtues were just a form of phronesis, right? As we've seen that, it's not the case that all the virtues, according to Aristotle, are just forms of phronesis or instances or examples or species of the genus phronesis. He clearly doesn't think that because of his earlier distinction, which is maintained in the Nicomachean Ethics pretty well throughout and quite solidly, that there is a distinction between intellectual virtues, and that's the camp of Phronesis, and moral or character virtues, and that's where you have all those other things like temperance and all these other things that are equally important. So it's not just phronesis on its own that's going to be virtue, so you shouldn't identify it. So Socrates, Aristotle might say, over-intellectualized the notion of virtue by identifying it with knowledge, right? So it's not merely that Socrates subordinated everything to rationality. He essentially equates it with it, which seems to be Aristotle's point. And that's where Aristotle is saying, well, I may subordinate it, maybe. I could argue that he does. But he's not saying it's exclusively that. It has to be a mixture. And if you recall, Aristotle stressed what a human being is a mixture ultimately of rationality, reason, and desire. So our emotions and our desires are important, but they have to be mixed properly and controlled in and through reason. Now, so Socrates, though, Aristotle says, yeah, he over-intellectualized, but he's right, at least to say that the virtues can't exist without phronesis. So phronesis, again, is requisite. It's necessary for true virtue. All right, so Aristotle, tries to support his view of the relationship between of character, virtue, and phronesis by appealing to what people say. So that's typical. In the next book, we will see Aristotle starting off, making a new start, and talking about how we have to start a new problem here, and we will start by looking at what people say. We've seen this throughout the Nicomachean Ethics. Remember, way back in book 1, when we were talking about, Aristotle's talking about eudaimonia, and he's saying, hey, let's look at what, the hoi polloi say, and these other groups in society. What do they think, the good and the agathos and eudaimonia, and what is all that stuff? So he always looks at what people say, and people say that character virtue leans in a certain way, but it's got to be regulated for reason. Now, Aristotle also wants to talk about the relationship between Phronesis and Sophia. And he says, look, let's modify a little bit what people say. That character virtue isn't like a disposition or something that just simply obeys Phronesis. So arete, character arete isn't simply just under the control of Phronesis. That's not true. Virtues are not merely conforming to principles, as Socrates said, or to be identified. Virtues are not simply forms of knowledge. So what Aristotle wants to say, look, you can't just have phronesis and be good. Because, phronesis might issue commands. It might tell you what you should be doing. It might be telling you about where the mean truly is and all that. But if you don't have a stable set of character virtues, then phronesis is going to be, it'll have vision, right? But it won't have the power that it needs. So it's, in a sense, it's the reverse of that earlier image of the person freighted up with moral character, lacking the vision and stumbling about and maybe getting it right and wrong from, parazara, just by accident here and there. The other, if you have just, it's all phronesis, then it might be the case that, you're always seeing what the right thing is to do. Great, so you got the vision there. But if you're not properly freighted, then there might only be some things you can do because you haven't got your fears under control. So you know what you should be doing, but your fear isn't controllable, so you can't really do it. So you need both. Aristotle thinks in the end, you shouldn't go too intellectualist, and you shouldn't totally remove intellectual aspects from morality altogether. In other words, you can't have you don't have true character unless you have phronesis, and you won't really have true phronesis unless it's, shall we say, buttressed or supported by a real character virtue. So, yes, there can be all these things by nature, but that's not true phronesis, acting, and true characters and all that. So he subordinates nature, and that's quite often a theme in Aristotle. He does subordinate the natural world and many things of it. We'll see this like crazy in the politics, where there's a subordination of things that are closer to natural things to those things that are more elevated in reason. So reason is ultimately in control. Now, Aristotle also picks up on what was a common issue back in ancient Greek thought, was the unity of the virtues. Aristotle says, look, if you look back, Socrates and Plato, especially if you check out Plato's Protagoras, that great dialogue where Socrates talks to the great sophist Protagoras, the unity of virtues, it's a fairly complex notion, but simply put, for our discussion here, it's if you have one, you really have to have them all. Why? Well, can you really be courageous or temperate or anything under all circumstances? Could you be, helpful, mild-mannered, or whatever if you weren't courageous? If you came into a situation that was frightening, would you be able to tell the truth and all that if you weren't able to control your fear? If you didn't have the virtue of courage, could you stand up and do what's right? And they more or less say, well, no, you couldn't. So you have, if you're truly going to be, someone who's temperate or something like that, you really have to be courageous. And so the unity of the virtues really means that they're more or less mutually independent. And then that lends itself nicely to, so, well, if they're that mutually independent and all that, aren't they just sort of different manifestations of some underlying reality? And that's a very Platonic notion, different manifestations, but there's one sort of underlying reality of which they are manifestations. So then Aristotle says, well, regarding the natural virtues, those are, again, as we've seen, the natural character audite bestowed by nature, and nature can be a little bit haphazard. So Aristotle says that a person may be naturally disposed to courage, but not that much on temperance. So it's possible that nature, shall we say, distributes these things, like a set of cards, and doesn't really give you the temperance card, but gives you the courage card. So this natural, this discussion of natural virtues allows Aristotle to make a little addition here. Well, the unity of the virtues, shall we say, that have one, have them all, okay? This here, if we think about this as with an asterisk here. Unity of the virtues, have one, have them all. Aristotle's addition will be, that this applies here to the ones that are acquired and learned. And in this sense, the ones that are natural, there we go. So he's got a bit of a, shall we say, an addition or a modification to this notion of the question of the unity of the virtues. Are they all instantiations of some higher thing? Aristotle said, well, it could be the case if you see it more or less in terms of the ones that are acquired and learned, okay, but not the natural ones, because as Aristotle said, nature can parcel them out in different ways. Okay, so this adds a little bit to the discussion that was common in Aristotle's time about the unity of the virtues. Last thing to finish up, and it's, I think, a quite fitting end to this chapter, that Aristotle wonders about the relationship now between phronesis, which, again, remember, deals with variable things, things of our making as they come into existence, and the things of our I shouldn't say making, things of our doing, because it's a praxis. Aristotle says, okay, that's what phronesis is about, what things I should do, etc., etc. But what about Sophia? This is more elevated knowledge. This is knowledge of eternal things. This seems to be odd that, and Aristotle mentioned this as a criticism, that phronesis, a lower kind of knowledge, should be issuing commands to Sophia, which is the higher kind of knowledge, and phronesis runs the whole thing. Aristotle says that it's not really the case that phronesis is in charge and actually bosses or runs or controls Sophia, right? He says that phronesis is more or less to Sophia as medical science is to health, right? Medical science is basically a system, right, of certain kinds of judgment. But medical science doesn't control health, right? It studies how to obtain health. It issues orders. Medical science issues, or shall we say, orders in the interests of health. Right? So it's the study of health, how to get healthy, and it gives orders on commands or whatever, or however you want to put it. But basically, the impetus to do things such that you become healthy. Aristotle says, if you really think about it, what is sort of the order of command here? Like, what is the relationship of command here? If Aristotle says this, if you think about health, health really is shall we say, well, to use some of Aristotle's language, it's more of the formal cause, right? We do medical science for the sake of health. And in that sense, medical science is, shall we say, a system of knowledge, and health is like a blueprint for that system of knowledge. So health determines what medical science really is. It's more or less an empirical point that what's medical science? Well, it's a reflection of what health really is, and it's in the interest of health that medical science makes its recommendations. So in that way, if you think of Sophia as health and Phronesis as medical science, it's Phronesis making recommendations in the interests of Sophia, how to add to it or increase it, as medical science makes recommendations in order to add to or to increase the health. But ultimately, what's really in control is the higher level truths really are controlling the lower level ones. It may appear, but that's illusory to think that it's the lower level ones that are controlling everything. No, they're making the comments, the claims, and the commands in for the sake of the higher one. Aristotle ends finally the book 6 he says, well, look, politics also kind of does this. Politics gives orders about everything in the state. It tells all the stuff we should do, even things like, well, not so common in our time, or at least in our systems of government, where you had in, let's say, liberal democracies, that tend to be, English-speaking, French-speaking, German-speaking, that have a clear separation of church and state. So in that sense, the politics doesn't, or at least not supposed to, either take its direction from or give direction to religious observances. That wasn't the case in Aristotle's time. They didn't have that distinction. So the state was also in charge of religious observances. And you find this in the Roman Empire as well. Well, politics gives the commands it does regarding religious observances, but it does it in order to please the gods, for the sake of the gods, not in any way controlling. So it's trying to get the religion right so it fits. Like it fits to the gods, like medical science is trying to get itself right so that it fits to health. So we shouldn't be confused or worried about that somehow a lower system of knowledge dealing with the variable is governing a higher system of knowledge that deals with the eternal and the permanent. So there we go. Once again, that's your wrap up. Chapter 13 brings this to a close and brings all of this in Book 6 to a close. So we've now got all of pretty well, of all the discussions of virtue done. Aristotle is going to totally shift gears in the next book and talk about something totally different. But you can think of it this way. Aristotle has given us a good chunk, not everything, but a sizable chunk of what you have to do in order to head on towards your ultimate goal. And remember, the ultimate goal is to unpack and to achieve this notion of eudaimonia. But in the next book, he's going to tell us some things to avoid so that you don't get sidetracked on your way to eudaimonia. Stay tuned for the next video.